Welcome to Psyched for Psychology, a Nystrom & Associates podcast. Our hosts, Michelle Iverson and Brett Cushing, are both licensed marriage and family therapists at Nystrom & Associates. Each week, they talk about all things mental health and therapy, and you get a chance to dive into specific psychology topics that help promote personal development and wellness. And now, here are your hosts, Michelle and Brett.
Hello and welcome to another podcast of Psyched for Psychology. My name is Brett Cushing and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist.
And I'm Michelle Iverson, also a licensed marriage and family therapist. Episodes for our podcast are going to be released weekly Tuesday mornings. You can email us at podcast@nystromcounseling.com. We would love to hear ideas for upcoming episode topics that you would be psyched to hear us talk about. So one of the topics that we wanted to talk about today is all about psychosis. We had actually talked about in a previous podcast, we started to get on this topic, and then we had to stop because I told Brett this is going to be an entire episode just on its own.
It is. It's a big topic.
Yes.
And I think we hear a lot about it too when people talk about the mental health crisis, and we hear about shootings, and we hear about people hurting one another. A lot of times people, I think, in their minds, they go to this.
They jump to this.
Yes. And then there's all sorts of misconceptions about it that can be really damaging and invalidating and not helpful.
Right. And what Brett is speaking to, which is actually the first thing, like we're going to talk about what psychosis is and like what do we mean when we use that term. But before we even talk about that, I wanted to talk about horror movies.
Oh, right.
Scary movies.
Yes.
Totally related topic, right?
It is. Yeah, I think people do. They think of the scary person, as the psychotic person or who's crazy, quote unquote. Yeah.
When I think about the stigma that happens around psychosis, I think about where did that stigma come from? And this isn't necessarily the one thing, the one contributor to stigma around psychosis and causing us to not really understand what psychosis is. But I do think of it as a pretty big contributor as to why people have misunderstandings about it. And a lot of misunderstandings about the people who experience it.
What do you think when you talk about those misunderstandings?
Yeah.
What does that lead to? When people have those misunderstandings, what does that lead to? What's the result of that?
Oh, we are going to get into a lot of that today, but a lot of it does have to do with increased risk of trauma for the person who is experiencing psychosis, which is really scary.
Right.
And we're going to talk about how scary that can be and what that can look like. So, speaking of scary, I made my promise. We're going to talk about horror movies for just a moment here. If you know me, you know I am a very big fan of horror films. And people like to make fun of me for it, but I will tell you what, I love them.
Wow.
From the classics to things that are much more modern. Still haven't seen Jordan Peele's Nope yet, but man, I want to see that the second I get the second two.
What's some that stand out for you that are notable that, when you think horror films, what stands out for you?
I think The Shining. I mean, that is a classic, Jack Nicholson, but also very interesting. I love Stephen King, and Stephen King hates that movie. He thought that movie misrepresented his book and his characters in his book. Importantly, he felt that he had a very strong female lead, and he felt that the Jack Nicholson, The Shining version of the movie really took away her
certainly did.
Power. And a lot of very interesting facts about behind the scenes and how that movie worked. So that one's my favorite. Do you have any favorites at all that you like to watch?
Mine that I find is very fascinating is The Exorcist.
Yes.
I think it's fascinating. What is it, 1972? I think somewhere in there. And it was released, and it's still the top-rated, most scary movie. It's something from the 70s. Can you believe that? Mm-hmm. So I find it interesting, and I was talking with my kids about horror movies, and as we're talking about this, I'm thinking it would be fun to do another Psych for Psychology podcast on why we even watch horror movies. What's the purpose of that? Because it is rather fascinating. But I digress.
I will probably pull together one of those because I love that topic. So with horror movies, I am not going to ruin a 60-year-old movie for anyone, but I am going to ruin it for you if you haven't watched this yet. When we think about Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, I mean, just look at the title of that movie right there, Psycho. It is known, if you've ever seen it, I'm going to ruin it for you if you haven't. It's a famous twist ending. So this seemingly very nice motel owner, his name's Norman. He seems to have this overbearing mother who it turns out that Norman turns out to be a quote unquote psycho, name of the movie. And his mom's actually dead. And so Norman's been living both as himself and as his mother, speaking like her. He's hearing his voice. He only kills people as mother because Norman wouldn't hurt a fly. But notice, what kind of myths and stigmas does that perpetuate? It perpetuates a myth of violence. It perpetuates this myth that people with psychosis have split personalities, which is not the case, right? In reality, psychosis does not change that person's personality itself. It is only changing their perception of the world and reality around them.
Well, yeah, and I think what do we hear then is people who see a movie like that, and we hear that title, and we see that character, and, you know, what do people say now? Well, that person's psychotic, or that person is psycho, and meaning, you know, they equivalent that to meaning that person's scary and needs to be avoided.
But then they are preemptively taking this word and associating it, when we use that in a clinical term, for very, very specific symptoms or collection of symptoms that we're going to talk about. We're using that very specifically, and it's for people who are actually way more at risk of being harmed than causing harm themselves. So essentially, that really was a big part of, you know, a trend we started to see in media. Because after Psycho, we started to see more movies. We actually started to see things like The Shining. I'm actually going to bring in The Shining. As much as I love it, it was a part of what added stigma. So the entire movie was actually depicting, and the novel was depicting, a descension into psychosis when the family is isolated in the snowed-in hotel in the mountains. And then the psychosis was being shown to directly result in this very extreme, very scary behavior. Famous axe scene, right? And he's chopping at the door saying, "Here's Johnny," right?
Yeah, I love that.
We are seeing someone, it feels like we're just waiting for that moment when they finally pop.
You're right. I think that's true. People, when they are around, because they don't understand. And really, that is what makes things scary in movies. We don't understand. We don't know what's coming next. And then we associate that with someone who has a psychological disorder, and we draw this conclusion: I'm vulnerable around this person because I don't understand. I don't know when they're going to snap. I don't know when they're going to come across with the "here's Johnny" kind of response. And so,
which was not in the book by any means.
But yeah, it's like people like have taken Psychosis, and Psychosis sells, you know, in movies, and now we have the stigma that goes along with it.
So that was part two. Why, when I spoke earlier, Stephen King did not like this movie. Part of it was he felt there was a lack of compassion and a lack of humanity given to these characters. He actually wrote the book because it was supposed to be a metaphor about a man being overcome by his alcoholism, which is really interesting. But a lot of people don't pick up on that in the movie. It becomes more related to psychosis, right? And it was interesting, too, because that was actually the alcoholism. That was something that Stephen King experienced himself. And so that was part of him processing his own journey. I did not know that.
Wow, that is fascinating. I'm learning things about Stephen King and psychosis at the same time.
Brett's having a fun time today.
I'm so, transfixed here. This is great.
Yeah. And then right around this time, we start to see the big boom in slasher movies. Halloween being big classic of that one as well and becoming popular. This one really was difficult when we think about, again, I love these movies. But when you look back on them as the lens of a therapist who works with clients experiencing psychosis, it's really hard to rewatch some of these. This is one that's hard to rewatch. The whole plot line of this is about someone with what they call in the movie profound psychosis. He's depicted as a murderer with supernatural powers. It perpetuates myths of madmen being monsters, somebody leaving a psychiatric hospital as being violent and dangerous. It also shows someone with catatonia and negative symptoms, which I'm going to teach you about what those are in a little bit, saying that those are indicators of somebody being evil, which really upsets me a lot.
That's powerful. Notice that jump from someone who has psychosis is evil, and Michael in Halloween is the embodiment of evil.
Yeah.
And I bet people listening would be like, well, the dude was pretty evil. And so, yeah, the character or the way that was portrayed. But again, notice how we are just naturally associating that, and we can't split that and say, well, that's the character in the movie. Psychosis is very different than the way it's being portrayed.
And here's where it gets really dangerous. If I could play this clip for you, I absolutely would. You can totally find it on YouTube. The protagonist of that movie is Michael's psychiatrist, the serial killer psychiatrist. His own psychiatrist says this about him. Says that he's displayed catatonia and negative symptoms for 15 years after, when he was only 6, this fictional character had killed his own sister. Said that 15 years after the incident, he had catatonia and negative symptoms. And then he is his own psychiatrist that says that is proof that Michael is evil.
And you watch that as a viewer of the movie, and you're really drawn into that. Like, yes, wow, this person is evil and is scary, and it's so hard then to differentiate the person from this stigma, from this false representation. And so I think you do a really nice job helping us see how this has been portrayed and why we need to address this.
So then I have people going, well, then, Michelle, I mean, these are fictional movies. Why does this matter? Well, I'm going to tell you why it matters. Brett, have you ever seen Silver Linings Playbook?
I've never even heard of
With Bradley Cooper.
I've not.
Yeah. Oh, it's really good. It is not a perfect representation, but the difference it makes for a client who watches a movie like that versus some of these older movies that we talked about that are horror films. This is a movie about a man struggling with bipolar disorder, and it's all about him connecting with a woman with depression. The movie's director made this movie because he wanted to offset any stigma around bipolar disorder because of his own son's struggle with it. I've had clients who have watched this movie and have walked away being like, that movie actually gets it and portrays what it's like in a humanizing way.
What's the name of the movie again? Because I want to watch it, and I bet other people might want to watch it now. What's it called?
It's called Silver Linings Playbook. It's a movie, but it's actually a book as well, too. This is actually a quote from the author on why he wrote this book. He said, Playbook gives people a safe place to start the conversation about mental illness. There's a silver lining to having mental illness, too. The way our brains are wired creates problems, but they can also create beautiful things.
Wow. Yeah, that's a nice balance there. And we don't see that. We see this dichotomous perspective towards psychosis, and they're all bad, or someone's all good. And psychosis is portrayed as bad, and it is nice because I do think of other movies where people are beginning to develop that sense of understanding and deepen compassion for those who are struggling. And really, that's a key word, struggling with psychosis.
So we're going to give you a couple myths and facts about psychosis. I'm going to give you one. Here's a myth. Psychosis wouldn't happen to me or somebody that I personally know. Well, here's the deal. Here's the fact. About 3 in 100 people, so about 3%, are going to experience an episode of psychosis in their life. We know that psychosis occurs across cultures, ages, genders. It could be caused by a multitude of issues and diagnoses outside of schizophrenia. And I'm going to cover all those in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Another myth that I'm aware of is that psychosis is the same as psychopath.
Right.
Or split personalities.
Where we hear from these movies and all that stigma.
Yeah. That person is psycho. That's a myth. The fact is that psychopath or split personalities are both references to separate mental health diagnoses. Both are really very different from psychosis. In psychosis, it really means a disconnection with reality. But this doesn't involve different personalities nor a desire to deliberately harm people. That's a very important distinction.
Absolutely. Another myth, people with psychosis couldn't live normal lives. Actually, fact, they do. Many people only experience 1 or 2 short-term psychosis episodes in their life. They end up finding a treatment that works to prevent any future episodes. And even those people that do experience ongoing episodes find excellent treatment that reduces that frequency and that intensity of those episodes too.
Yeah, Michelle, I'm so glad you brought up that myth because I can hear people, I've heard people say, well, why do they let people like that out? Those people need to be locked up. And
I wonder which movie that might have come from, you know?
Yeah. And it's really fueled by misunderstanding. It's because psychosis sells and fear motivates us. So I'm so glad you brought that up. These are people and they're hurting and they don't have to be locked up. There's hope for them. How about this myth? People are experiencing psychosis. They're dangerous and violent, closely related to what we were just talking about. The fact is that rates of violence against people with mental illness is much higher for those in the general population and even more so for those experiencing psychosis because their sense of reality is altered. So people with psychosis are often portrayed as the perpetrator when really they're the ones who are most vulnerable and they're the ones that are getting hurt. And how tragic is that? Psychosis symptoms actually increases the risk of that person with psychosis experiencing homicide, suicide, self-harm, or other hazards. So they could, for instance, walk into traffic because of their symptoms that interfere with seeing cars, and these are vulnerable people. And isn't it ironic, tragically ironic, that we see ourselves as the vulnerable ones from them rather than seeing them as the vulnerable ones? It just in
that's the reality.
Yes.
So going back to our initial question, what really is then psychosis? We talked about all these things that it's not. Ultimately, it is a break in reality. One of my favorite quotes comes from Dr. Aubrey Moe. She is a director at the Early Psychosis Intervention Center at Ohio State University, and she says this: psychosis is a symptom, but it doesn't tell you what the illness is. It's like a fever. If you have a fever, you know something's wrong, but you don't know whether it's the flu, a cold, or something else. So let's take a look at this a little bit more. If I could have people, when I try and describe what this is, I say, imagine an umbrella. If you look at the umbrella piece on its own, that is psychosis, but it's an umbrella covering so many different things below. This umbrella reaches over all of these different symptoms and diagnoses, all of which can fall under what psychosis could be. So when we think about what falls under that umbrella, what symptoms we think of, well, a lot of people are pretty familiar with some of the common symptoms. So they might think of hallucinations, hearing things that aren't there, seeing things that aren't there. They might think of paranoia. They might think of delusions. We'll talk about those in a moment. But they can include other things as well, too. They can include things like catatonia. They can include things like negative symptoms. I'll explain what those are. It also includes things like disorganized speech and behavior. It also includes something called anosognosia, which is not having insight, realization that you're sick. And we're going to talk about that too. When we talk about diagnoses, what all diagnoses fall under this umbrella? So many people automatically go straight to, well, schizophrenia. Well, that's one. But there's a lot of others, and some of these might surprise you. We see schizophrenia. We see bipolar disorder. Sometimes that can occur with psychosis. There is a form of postpartum psychosis that we talked about in an earlier podcast with Samantha. But we can also see psychosis happening when there's substance and medication issues that can sometimes induce psychosis. Sometimes people will experience delirium. Dementia and Alzheimer's can sometimes include psychosis. Sometimes brain damage from a tumor or a stroke can cause this. And actually, there's so many more medical diagnoses that can also relate in psychosis, which again, not a lot of people realize. And that's why so many people can actually be affected by this.
Right.
So when we think about what is a hallucination, this is any experience where you see, hear, feel, or smell something that does not exist. That one always surprises people, the smell. So think about it. You can hear, see, feel, or smell things that are not there. That is scary because that's your own senses not working in the way that anybody else's senses might. And again, this is not always related to a mental health concern. This can happen if somebody is excessively consuming alcohol, drugs, and substance use, if you're going through withdrawal of those substances, if somebody goes through prolonged sleep deprivation, extreme starvation, extreme stress, and again, there's some medications where this can be a side effect of it too.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. What's paranoia? That's intense, irrational, persistent thought processes involving very fearful, scary feelings and thoughts for that person. You tend to end up being very distrustful of other people and their intentions. And again, doesn't just happen with mental health. It can happen when somebody goes through isolation, trauma, extreme anxiety, and again, substance use can cause this too. And if somebody is continuing to have severe paranoia, suspicion, then it could turn into a delusion. Delusions are false, fixed beliefs. They do not change, even if somebody is given evidence of that. Did you know there's two types of delusions?
I did.
There's bizarre and there's non-bizarre. Bizarre, clearly implausible. If you and I are within the same type of culture, we cannot understand where that's coming from. So a really bizarre delusion, right? Somebody took all of the organs out of my body, somehow replaced them with somebody else's, and there's no wounds or scars on my body anywhere. That would be a bizarre. But non-bizarre, that would be something that they're saying is occurring in my life, which might not be out of the realm of possibility. So things like the police have me under surveillance. My friend is really a government agent. There's a possibility, right?
There is a possibility.
Be
and because people that are delusional, they're so convinced of it, you kind of find yourself, even as a therapist, a trained therapist, you get sucked in sometimes like, oh, wow, that must be terrible. Because you want to empathize with the anxiety that they're having, and you want to sort of enter into this. And sometimes it might take a couple sessions where you're kind of saying, well, I don't know, I wonder. So these non-bizarre are really difficult to really identify. But I think it also speaks to how do we relate to people of psychosis. And maybe we'll talk on that just in a little bit.
Absolutely. Few other symptoms: disorganized speech and behavior. If I've got jumbled thoughts, I can't carry on, keep track of conversations, remember things, take care of like my daily hygiene, like shower, brush my teeth. It might look very confusing to people to kind of wonder what is going on, but sometimes that is an indicator, right? That some of these, this break from reality could be occurring for some people. And what's interesting is that these symptoms are sometimes more difficult, more debilitating than those hallucinations and the paranoia. And part of this is because a lot of our medications, they honestly aren't as effective in trying to help with this aspect of the illness. But there are parts of treatment, things like cognitive remediation, that can help, especially early on in psychosis. And then negative symptoms. This one always kind of tripped me up a little bit when I was first learning about it. Negative does not mean bad. It means something is gone. So, for example, to help, if I were to say a positive symptom of psychosis does not mean good, it just means that something has been added, something is new. We're talking about, those would be the delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, disorganized speech. Negative just means something has been taken away. So that would be no affect. That person have very little to no emotion being like shown on their face. Trouble concentrating, trouble with their speech. I see a lot of clients that experience this lack of motivation, not because they don't want to do things, but this is part of the symptom of the psychosis that they feel that they can't. Having trouble feeling emotions and even having trouble just making eye contact as well too. So again, this is why treatment is so helpful. There's so many different forms of therapy. Even if the medication is working to try to address the positive symptoms, the negative symptoms can be helped with a lot of different types of treatment. And then catatonia, this is one in which it's a really broad example, but essentially people who are conscious but not really moving or kind of interacting with things. People might have very like rigid and fixed posture. So you might see like if somebody was catatonic and if I was to take your arm and to put your arm in like an awkward position, most people would just put their arm back where it was comfortable. That person with catatonia would not move their arm. They would feel as though they couldn't move their arm. Sometimes we might see mutism, so very little and no verbal response. They can't really talk and can't really respond to anything around them.
Mm-hmm. Think of catatonia. Think of what is his name? Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Yes, that's a great example.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And then the last symptom I want to talk about, anosognosia, where there's little to no insight that I am sick. This is not the same thing as being in denial. It would be the same, and we see this in psychosis sometimes, and then sometimes we see neurology. We'll see that for their clients as well too. And the way a neurologist might describe it is, I could not teach you that particular part of your brain is not working right now. Mm-hmm. It just is no insight, no ability to know that that is not working. Which again, a lot of people, they take it as like that they're in denial. They don't want to do what we're asking them to do. They don't want to believe that delusion's not real. That's not what's really happening. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to give everybody listening today an example of a bunch of these. So if everybody wants to imagine the following, and this is going to take me about a minute to read. This kind of walks through an example of what it would be like to experience a number of the symptoms that we talked about with the anosognosia, the lack of insight. But if anybody feels like they would like to skip this part, feel free to jump ahead about a minute or two into the podcast. We'll still be here and able to talk about it some more. But I'm going to go ahead and read you a little bit about what it would be like to go through this. And Brett, I'm going to ask you some questions.
Okay.
At the end. So imagine the following. I just told you that you don't live where you think you live, whether it's your house, your apartment, your condo, wherever. So I just told you that. And you laugh at me and tell me, hey, Michelle, stop joking around. I then show you a restraining order from court telling you to stay away from what you know is your home address. You see the signatures of your own family members' names signing off on this order. So you immediately call your home phone number to talk to your family about it and see what's going on. The person on the other end says, hey, you seem like a really nice person, but if you keep coming around here, we're going to call the police. You don't live here and we don't want to press charges. Please stop calling us. You need help. You're scared and confused. You decide to drive home, and when you arrive, you're arrested by the police and they take you to the ER. So, Brett, How would you feel about being at the hospital after having all of that happen?
Such a rush of negative emotions. And when I say negative, I mean really bad. I'm feeling overwhelmed, probably panicky.
Panicky, absolutely.
And imagine if I'm feeling panicky and I act that out and people see that, it sort of reinforces that, see, we knew this person's crazy. And really, I'm panicked. And then I'm also feeling isolated because nobody understands. Nobody cares. I feel rejection. There's so many of these emotions all at once, and they're all really intense and scary. I think of like Neo for those who have seen The Matrix, and he begins to realize reality isn't the way it is, that I've always experienced it. That I'm part of this matrix. And I remember there's one of the characters watching him as he's beginning to realize this, says, he's going to pop. And that's kind of what happens. And it's just an incredible flood of emotion and thoughts trying to make sense of it. It's almost like you're falling without any reference point, to kind of get your bearings. Terrifying.
Do you think it would feel traumatizing?
Not only traumatizing.
Yeah.
Now that would be a horror film.
Yeah.
That would be a scary film to capture what it's like for someone who might be experiencing psychosis. They're the ones who are not so much scary. They're the ones who are really scared.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think you would be open or receptive at the hospital to being told that you're ill or you need to take medication?
No.
No.
Yeah.
Right.
No, my wife would very quickly say, nope, he wouldn't. I'm sure it would be very resistant, and not only resistant, I think insistent. I'm not going to, let somebody have that kind of control over me.
So this is an example. This is a great excerpt. This comes from a wonderful book written by Dr. Javier Amador. It's called I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. And he wrote it, he's a psychologist, and he wrote it because his own brother had schizophrenia and psychosis. And a lot of it was written from his perspective on understanding. That was a lot of what drove him to research this and understand anosognosia. And this is a great example of that, a great example of a delusion happening and the anosognosia that comes along with it, and how difficult that is for that person and how traumatized they can become when they end up confronted by police, when their own brain is saying, this is my home, this is my family, and to find out that it's not. And so he wrote this book with a lot of, and I do highly recommend it, with an understanding of how do we help our family members, if you're a therapist, your clients, how do I help them when they are experiencing this, and do it in a way where we're not going to traumatize them.
Powerful.
So there's a few things that I wanted to talk about for today, because knowing that we do a lot of training with therapists on, what do we do in sessions to help clients if they're experiencing psychosis, if they are experiencing anosognosia. I think the big thing that I always come back to is how do we continue to keep destigmatizing this? There are so many resources out there. There's actually a really great one, YouTube channel called Living with Schizophrenia. And it's written by a woman who had psychosis, and she does a great job of demystifying and breaking down stigma. And she does interviews with other people who have experienced it too, to really get to see, this is what it's like, and it's not a scary thing. It's something that a lot of people, more people than we know, deal with and get help to overcome with.
Yeah, and I think, again, going back to, it's not that they are scary, they are scared.
Yeah.
And think about maybe when was a time in our lives when we were truly scared? Not just sort of like, oh, what was that noise? But like pervasive, intense fear, just overwhelmed with it.
Yeah.
And if you've experienced that, what was helpful for you? It's generally someone who is is able to just come alongside and have a non-anxious presence, give you a lot of reassurance. So think about that and think about yourself as we go through this, what to do, and think about maybe a time when you've been absolutely terrified and somebody was able to come alongside of you and what they did and how it helped you. And that's going to really transfer to what we're talking about here and what to do.
I'm going to tell you first what not to do, though. Okay. There's a number of things to not do. For one, we're not going to criticize or blame the person for the psychosis or their actions related to the psychosis. As we saw in that example, even if I was that police officer or somebody watching, it makes no sense to me what this person is doing. But as we could see from that example, it made perfect sense to them. It made perfect sense because their reality was altered. We are also going to avoid denying or arguing with them about their reality, saying things like, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, the government isn't tapping our house. We're not going to take what they say personally. That paranoia, psychosis, it can lead to mistrust and suspicion, even with our closest friends and family. All of our relationships can be called into question, affected by these delusions. So we don't want to take those personally at all when they are sick. We also don't want to directly confront them. If you want to be heard, you might need to find a different way to communicate with the person. But just know being heard sometimes isn't always possible when somebody's in the middle of that psychotic episode. We also don't want to tell them that they are psychotic. Telling them that is not going to convince them to just stop thinking that way. We don't want to dismiss concerns or laugh it off. Even if the concerns seem bizarre or shocking, they are not amusing to that person having that episode. We have to remember their brain believes these things are going on. We don't want to encourage the psychosis either by confirming delusions. The reality around this is we don't need to agree with what they are saying or comment on it directly. It's just supportive statements are going to suffice. So here's an example of what to say that would be helpful. I don't know what happened, but it sounds very scary. Or there's a lot of things that happen in the world that I can't explain. Or I don't know what to make of what you're saying. It's so confusing and upsetting to hear everything you're telling me. How are you handling it? We don't want to focus on correcting the reality of the delusion and kind of be wasting time because we can't kind of change delusions with reason and logic. And we don't want to get angry. They're experiencing this because their brain is playing tricks on them. They are not in control of what's happening in their mind.
Yeah, they're not in control. And when I think about things to do, it relates in general two things to do: be calm and give them control because they don't feel it. So let me highlight a few things. First of all, be calm and to be gentle. Be slow in your movements, lower tone of voice, slow as you're talking, and just have a soothing sound. Be calm because it's contagious. If I have a non-anxious presence, that's contagious. Make them comfortable to share what's going on in their life. And part of that is being calm and showing general interest, no judgments like you were talking about. Just show interest without any kind of judgment. Next, focus on what is troubling them. Really take genuine interest in what is going on and what it's like for them. Try to just, and I think of a metaphor for when I work with people who are struggling with this, just walk down that ladder into the pit with them and just sit and say, tell me just what's going on. Next, empathize with their situation. Some things you can say is, wow, it must be so scary to, for instance, see all those UPS trucks monitoring you. Or I really like to say and lead with this. It makes sense. It makes sense that you're scared about this. It makes sense that this is stressful. So empathize. It really helps bring other people's emotions down when we can do that. Focus on their feelings and what they say, not the actual facts of their story, but focus on the feelings because it's real for them. If I believe something, no matter whether it's real or not, it's real to me. And those feelings are very real. And we want to validate those feelings. Next, ask if you can help. A good thing we need to learn to say to each other is, how can I help? Rather than just try to fix it. Because when I try to fix it for you, Michelle, what I'm really trying to do is I'm saying, you know what? Your pain and your difficulty is too much for me to bear, so I'm going to fix you so I feel better. And just notice how selfish that is. We don't want to fix it. We want to feel it with them. Next, ask about things you know that they enjoy. Get them focusing on the positive, and then you focus on the positive, right? And focus on their strengths, because so much of their life is on the negative feelings they're experiencing, the invalidation they're experiencing from other people. Focus on the strengths. For what a wonderful gift to give them. Share love in a way that they can tolerate. Now, this may simply be by giving your full attention to their thoughts. And also, contact their treatment team. Let them know that, what you're seeing, especially if it's concerning. If you think they are getting worse, tell their providers, tell their therapists. Even if you don't have consent to speak with their treatment team, you can always leave a message. Find a way to communicate your concerns, even if it involves sending a letter to the doctor. Tell the staff up front that you understand they cannot acknowledge if the person is a patient, and you just need to leave a message. And last of all, don't underestimate the power of human connection. Michelle, when I think of people who are dealing with psychosis, I think of the ancient times when people had leprosy. When people had leprosy, it was a highly contagious skin disease. And so if somebody touched another person who had leprosy, you were most likely going to get leprosy. And then what happened is they were put in a leper colony, and you were isolated from everybody. And just imagine that you never experienced any physical touch from anybody ever again. And it's such a huge, significant human experience we need to have, and yet you're isolated. And then to make it worse, people with leprosy would go through a town, and because of this highly contagious effect, people in front of them would be yelling out, "Unclean, unclean, unclean," and everybody would scatter. I think people who have psychosis are modern day lepers in our culture today. And they're walking through, and we have movies, and we have media, and we have voices of many others that are crying out unclean, and we need to isolate these people. And so we don't want to underestimate that these are people who are struggling. These are people who are scared. They're not scary, and they need that human connection.
And when their brain is isolating them too, on top of it all. Absolutely.
Such a feeling of powerlessness, and to come alongside and just be with them and validate that this is what's going on for them. I'm so glad we talked about this today.
This is I love this topic. This one's very personal to me, because when you can see people start that journey and being so scared and sometimes traumatized, and to see them go through treatment and heal and see their brains heal, and just to see that progress and kind of be with them through that journey, and to be that person that can be that non-judgmental support to help them through. Some of the things that every day make me just love being a therapist so much.
It is a privilege. And we hope in our podcast today, we've given you some ability to change some of these negative perceptions about people with psychosis, and some practical things that you could do in response to that. And I think of what we've said in other podcasts before. Hopefully this will change our way of interacting with other people, so that we don't look at them and ask ourselves, what is wrong with them? And begin to start asking, I wonder what happened to them, so that we can move towards them with compassion and healing and understanding.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And make sure to like, share, subscribe to our Psych for Psychology podcast. We're going to continue to have new episodes being released every week. And you can find us on any major podcast streaming platform.
Please email us your comments to podcast@nystromcounseling.com. That's podcast@nystromcounseling.com. And let us know if any ideas for future topics that you would be psyched to hear us talk about. Again, if you can also learn about Nystrom and Associates and all our available mental health services by going to nystromcounseling.com. Thank you again for joining us. We are psyched to talk with you again soon.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom & Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.